basically according to an inquisitive-based system, which general investigations are done in this fashion. But we decided to actually do it under a different system and allow the company to accompany the whole process during the investigation. And we wanted to be completely transparent. And there's a very interesting episode here, which I think is important for us to reflect upon. So we began, or we opened up this to the company as well. And the company or the corporate attorneys and the directors and the management asked us for an appointment. We had a meeting with the corporate lawyers and their management, and where they wanted to negotiate a settlement to actually close the investigation before it even began. And that really caught our attention. On one side, well, precisely due to the issues of transitional justice, well, we said, no, no, that doesn't make any sense because one of the pillars is to reveal truth. Despite in this investigation, even if we don't have an effective result at the end, still we need to understand the truth before we know the that we need to repair. We need to know exactly what was actually caused, the damage that actually occurred, what were the facts. So with the the corporation asking us to have a settlement to stop the investigation, we did not agree with. So we continued with the investigation at the end of 2015. And there was another interesting episode here. The corporation in Germany actually hired an independent investigator, a university professor, Christopher Copper, from the University of Bielefeld, in order to do an investigation that for us we thought it was important because he was gonna have access to documents from the matrix from the company in Germany, something that we were not able to do. Despite that, in several occasions, we actually had requested that the documents in Germany would be sent to us. So they were in Brazil, they had met with us, we exchanged information. We provided all the information to that lawyer that we had because we had to be transparent in that regard. But it was the only opportunity that we have. And we had many doubts, we had many concerns. And obviously, this is an issue that the lab knows very well, that there are many times where these independent investigators seem to be more people that want to actually clean somebody's image to make it seem that something's transparent. But we have many doubts. We didn't understand how independent that investigator really was. Fortunately speaking, at the end, we saw that the report was actually very good, that they worked with a lot of independence and autonomy. And it's very positive, and I think we wanted to highlight this process as well. We, as prosecutors in Brazil, from all three different institutions, we also decided that the complexity of these cases and the needs to search for information, documentary images, narratives, history, because it wasn't a strictly judicial investigation, but rather it was also historical investigation. We actually hired we also hired an independent investigator, a Brazilian investigator that had a lot of experience and that had worked with the Truth Commission with a lot of experience in public security. Professor Waras Siningar, which is a professor from that university as well. And on his side, he produced another report. And in parallel, we did the more judicial side of things, like the interviews into witnesses, interviews to the victims, interviews to family members of the victims. All of this with different meetings, always with the participation of the movements of civil society that decided to participate. So this is a very transparent process, a very open process, very contradictory, in fact. And at the end of 2017, at the end of that year, we had a rough draft or a pre-report already prepared. So once again, we called the corporation and we presented to the corporate attorneys. We sent them our preliminary conclusions on this specific point, and we told the corporation, here we have two different scenarios. One is a normal scenario, traditional scenario, that we're going to come in with a civil action, a public civil action. That's the terminology that is used in Brazil in order to actually seek out reparations. But according to Brazilian law, we're also allowed to have an agreement, a conduct-based agreement, or a behavior agreement to prevent this litigation, this legal proceeding. For us, it was very important, or it was very interesting to have the idea of having this agreement. Why was the agreement so interesting? First of all, because Brazil very different from other countries, different from my friend Marcelo's country, Argentina, still applies amnesty laws. We still have amnesty laws in Brazil. So Brazil is the only country in all of Latin America that has not revised its amnesty laws, despite having two sentences by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights Court signing the invalidity of amnesty laws. But the Brazilian Supreme Court continues to apply amnesty laws, and the judicial courts in Brazil continue to apply amnesty, even sometimes for reparations which are civil as well. I have experiences with other nations, not against companies, but against individuals specifically that have actually applied it. So the perspectives in Brazil, the success perspectives of a judicial action were very doubtful, really, because of the amnesty procedures. And it would mean that we would have a long court battle to be able to come up with a solution. And obviously, a long time would mean that victims would have to wait a long time. And this is always a severe problem because victims are dying from a dictatorship that already 50 years ago, and many of these are already passing away. So this is a very favorable element for us. It was a bit of pressure. There's two other important elements that I wanted to highlight in our motivation to come up with an agreement. One was that Brazil had already lived at this particular moment, which was 2017 or the beginning of 2018. They already had deterioration of their political scenarios. They had gone from the impeachment of Dilma and President Dilma, and clearly there was a new policy for reducing human rights and reducing policies related to reparations from the dictatorship. So this is another element which was important. We needed to have an agreement with companies such as so big as Volkswagen at a moment in which we were having so many political setbacks in terms of human rights was important, and it was a symbolic factor which was very strong. More than simple litigation to say that we can actually come up with an agreement during these troubling times. So these elements of opening up historical precedent was also very important. And in fact, the negotiation with the company was very quickly done until the presidential elections occurred. And there, very quickly, this was perceived. There was 9 months that passed by. But despite all of this, we had deterioration post-election. So we perceived that the company had certain concerns to celebrate this agreement. And for us, we understand that because maybe it would mean that there would be that the company would that maybe would I'm not sure how the international public is here. Just simply to explain, the Brazilian president, his idol is the Coronel, which was the chief of the MICE, or the most cruel center for tortures during the dictatorship. It's his hero. It's the president of Brazil's hero. He said it himself. So he's already dead, but basically he was one of the main perpetrators that I was actually processing. So coming up with an agreement that involved these issues that had a symbolic factor was very important. Obviously, the company in a negotiated context, in my opinion, they never confessed this, but this is my opinion. This is something that I come with, but I think that they had lots of difficulties in this regard. So the process was very doubtful. On two moments, we thought that there was a possibility that the negotiation would crumble because of the threat to retaliations. And we actually notified the president of Volkswagen in Germany, and we said, hey, look, we're maybe stopping the negotiation if we don't change something in concrete. And there's another very interesting aspect, which is talking about partnerships. For us, it was very important to have a partnership with an NGO organization in Germany, which was specialized in human rights in Germany or worldwide human rights, the Center for Constitutions, Human Rights, under the leadership of Monsignor Kalik. And as a strategy, we as prosecutors, we have to perceive that we are connected with what exists around human rights, despite being in civil societies and despite being autonomous organizations. And this was uh, fundamental because with the Institution for Human Rights Center, they began to read about Volkswagen's thinking in Germany. We started to understand what Volkswagen was thinking, and this is part of the strategy. So we were also in contact, in fact, with actual Congress people from the SPD party, because if Germany, we needed to understand if Germany wanted this agreement to occur or not as a country. And finally, the company actually continued to advance. They sent a representative, a specific representative, to talk about this specific issue. And I think my time is up, unfortunately. If not, I would go on forever. But you have 2 minutes, Marlon. You have 2 minutes. Fantastic. Okay. With certain other difficulties, and just to give you a few ideas, the last hour when we came up with an agreement, when the agreement was all developed, a group that had participated through with the process, a group of workers or the labor movement actually opposed the agreement or the terms of agreement. Amongst the many groups that actually supported the project, there was one group that completely opposed it, and for that, and it was a problem for us because we're simply intermediaries of the process between the corporation and the Brazilian state and victims. And at the end, this actually set back the agreement quite a bit. And actually, we actually stopped it for a couple months to try to come to a common ground with this group. And at the end of the day, it was impossible. And obviously, you can find criticism to the agreement. And obviously, it's very good to be critical of any agreement, something which was very innovative. But part of the victims did not even accept it. They thought that the agreements had the weakness, and of course, it had weakness. If not, it wouldn't be agreement. It would be a judicial victory. If not, it wouldn't have been an agreement. The agreement would basically be based, and I'll end with this, Tatiana. The agreement was based, or was always based on the idea of the pillars or transitional justice pillars. So a main pillar was reparation to victims, direct victims. And here it's also important to say that the company did not want to have the role of defining reparations or having direct relationships with the victims themselves. So here we developed a series of judicial spaces together with an arbitrator in order to actually work out the indemnization. We built a fund for the reparation. A fund was actually created, and currently, unfortunately, the exchange rate is pretty bad, but it's equivalent to about $3.5 million. When we began to negotiate, it was more than $5 million, but the exchange rate just drastically changed. Unfortunately, it lost value due to devaluation of the currency. And there's also reparations of a collective nature as well. Another reparation is that the company had a public declaration related to this issue, recognizing its participation during the dictatorship, doing this recognition of the participation of the during the dictatorship. The company actually had to admit it, and they were also based on this agreement that they were financing a center for memory or historical memory about justice and human rights. They agreed to finance this, and they're also financing new investigation via the federal Sao Paulo University, and for new investigations, for other investigations related to other corporations with dictatorships and authoritarian regimes. And they're also finding the structuring of a lab, state of the art technology lab in terms of DNA exams that supports different technologies, forensic anthropology, etc. Also from the university, which we have an agreement with, a partnership which is very effective. So that is the scenario. And the corporation actually concluded all the different obligations that the company had actually assumed, and they've already complied with all the reparations that they agreed upon. The payments have been made. Money has been transferred. The declaration has been published in the Brazilian newspapers that were agreed upon. So the corporation has complied with the agreements, and the agreement and the process has ended. Now we continue to monitor that the application of these resources by the third parties that were actually benefit are actually successful as well, and they receive the funds that they were promised, and they will be successful. Well, let me stop now. I hope that I can clarify any of this. It's a very complex history. I know making what is long short, and obviously I'm available to answer any questions that are asked later on. Thank you very much. Thank you, Marlon. I'm certain that many questions will come out from this case. I think people are very curious, but for the moment, let's go on to Marcelo, which will speak about the Argentinian case. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you so much to Gabriel and Tatiana for organizing the event. And I will also try to be like Marlon and try to make something that has been very long and try to wrap it up and summarize it in just a few minutes. I know it's not going to be easy, but I'll try my best. Well, let me talk about the historical perspectives of the case first. Obviously, if this is the place we should be interested in starting. And the Ford trial basically started after many years in December of 2017. That was when the Ford case started, and it concluded 1 year later when the sentence to the military personnel Rivero as the co-author of the kidnappings and the torture against workers from the factory. And at the same time, this is what is innovative. They sent to prison the ex-chief of security of the Ford plant, Mr. Sevilla. He was condemned to 12 years in prison, and the ex-manager of manufacturing, whose name is Pedro Mueller, whom was sentenced to 10 years as a participant in these crimes. During the trial, the 24 victims whose cases were on trial, this was during the times of the facts they were actually workers in Ford Motors, Argentina, anonymous society, or and that their intentions were due to a common denominator, which was related to the participation of these people in different activities. From the total investigated acts, 22 of those occurred in a 1 month time space from March 24th of 76, which was when we had the military coup, to April 31st of 1976. And we were able to establish that apart from this, 17 victims had been actually arrested within the factory or kidnapped within the factory during their actual working days. So they were actually kidnapped on the public roads or in their homes. In terms of the sentenced civilians, we had those that they actually had the evidence with the victims of the case, so they can be actually kidnapped by the military forces, so that they would have the repression plan that was implemented by the military government will work out within the corporation itself. Concretely speaking, the prosecutor's office that I was in charge of that time, and the people that were helping me in these cases, or my collaborators and myself, we actually provided essential evidence to the case, like facilitating the personal data of each of the employees that were involved, their home addresses, together with the photographs that we obtained of the personnel, so that in that fashion they can actually be located and then kidnapped. But they were also held responsible for allowing to set up a detention and torture center within the factory itself, so that the workers will be taken there to be interrogated and in some cases tortured, to later be sent with no registry or no log at all to commissaries' offices, where they were treated with inhumane detentions and then actually accused of as national criminals and sent to prisons where some of them remained for many years. During the trial and the accusing parties were We heard the victims' testimonies.
a sus familiares,
We heard their
algunos
family members.
prácticamente habían
Some of the
fallecido,
victims had already
otros
passed away.
hechos habían
Out of
transcurrido
those facts,
alrededor de 40 años,
several
y a otros
40 more than 40 years have passed us,
obreros de la
and
planta
many of the workers that
reportaron
were witnesses
que
that
no
actually
fueron
witnessed the
abiertos los
kidnappings
informes
to were
para
actually called to
materialización.
testify so they can
Fue
actually
muy importante la
reconstruct the
fase
case.
regular realizada
And the inspection, the visual
durante los
inspection
años,
during the
porque durante
Ford
ese
plant
incidente
inspection was
se
very important because during the Ford
identificaban
inspection, we
los
gave the
lugares
victims an opportunity to
donde estaban
recognize as the places where they
el
worked,
lugar donde habían sido
the place where
secuestrados
they had actually
y también
been kidnapped,
habían
and also
sido sometidos algunos de
where
ellos
some of them
o
had
torturados
been
o a sufrir
tortured
condiciones inhumanas de cautiverio.
or were in
Además,
captive
durante la
or were
inspección
held
física
captive in inhumane
pudimos
societies. And
observar
during the
el
inspection, we were able
distanciamiento
to
de
see the
seguridad
distance between the actual locations where they produced
y
the
las oficinas
kidnappings
que ocupaban las
and the
personas, los
offices
civiles que
that
fueron
the civilians
condenados.
that were
Y
condemned
también
had
diferentes
them. And
rehabilitaciones
finally,
que los militares habían
the
ocupado
the locations that the
dentro
military
de esa
had
zona, en un centro
been using
de detención y
and these
tortura.
different torture
Este
hidden
es el
locations.
lugar donde
This is the
habían
place where
comenzado los padecimientos de casi todas las
almost all the
Lo mismo
victims
ocurrió
had
también con
started
los otros
their sufferings. And the same thing when they
lugares donde
inspected
fueron
the
conducidos
both
de
commissaries'
forma
offices
clandestina
where secretly the
hasta
victims were
juicio.
taken until they were actually sentenced.
También durante quedó perfectamente
During the
claro que los
trial,
hechos en cuestión
it was
fueron
also
debido a los
shown,
estrictos
demonstrated
criterios
that this
del
was
plan
due to the general purpose
sistemático
of the
de
systematic plan,
eliminación
an elimination
ejecutado
plan that was
por
actually
las fuerzas
perpetrated
y que tales
by
propósitos
force
generales contaban con
and
los
general
recursos
purposes with the
económicos
support,
que se dieron
the
por el
economic
nuevo
powers
periodo
that were
de
actually
derechos
benefiting
reconocidos.
by the
De
new
ese modo, los
order.
intereses generales y particulares
So
de
in this
empleados
way,
directivos
different
de la
interested
planta y
parties
de la empresa
and the
Ford
personnel from Ford
fueron
corporations in that
encargados de
location
señalar a los
were actually in
trabajadores
charge
que de
of
algún modo
actually pointing out the workers that should be an
ofrecían en
obstacle
riesgo la
or
disciplina
were
interna de
putting
la planta
internal discipline
y
of the
lograron
plant at
conseguir,
risk.
por un lado, la
On
desvinculación
one
de sus
way,
obreros de la empresa
actually removing
y,
those
por
workers
otro
from the
lado,
company, and on the
mandando
other
un
side,
mensaje de
sending a clear message that
dirigido a los demás
discipline will be mandated to
obreros
the rest of the workers so they would
para
abandon the
mejorar las
fight
condiciones
to
laborales.
improve working conditions.
De tal forma que los imputados, en
So
sus
those
roles,
people that were
escogieron a
accused
sus
in their roles, they
víctimas
selected the
y
victims
las
and they chose the
sometieron a
victims
represión
and
y
they
sometimiento
actually gave them to the people,
de la libertad
and they knew that they were
hasta
actually
someterlos
going
a
to be
permanentes
taken to physical
privaciones de
torment
libertad
and
mediante
removed from their
torturas,
liberty. So they had a
y
systematic
brindándoles
plan and they took advantage of it and
efectivos
they
recursos
provided
materiales y humanos
them the material human
necesarios
resources
con la finalidad de
to
beneficiar
actually undertake this
fines
crime
políticos económicos.
because of they had political motives and economic
Por supuesto,
motives.
lo novedoso del juicio fue la
I think the
participación
innovative thing about this trial
de
was that we had the
empresarios
participation of
emblemáticos
upper management of an emblematic company such as Ford
en lo que fue una depuración interna de su
in
planta
an
de
internal
trabajadores con el objetivo de
cleaning
sacar de
of
encima a
their
aquellos
plant
que no
by
respondían a
removing
sus lógicas
those
empresariales
employees that were
y
not
que
in
las
pro
cuestionaban.
of or that
Como ya
question
dije
the policies
anteriormente,
of the company
disciplinar fuertemente a la más obrera
or
para lograr
actually
beneficios
punish
económicos
the
dentro del
workers to
nuevo
have better economic benefits
esquema trazado
within
por
the
la
new
dictadura.
scheme that the dictatorship had worked
Para
with.
la imputación se consideró la relevancia que tenían
For
los
the
hechos
accusation,
en el contexto
they
de la acción delictiva
considered the
y
different
se
criminal
estimó que
actions
debía
that
haber
were provided that
una
necessarily
forma de colaboración o de
we
ayuda entre
actually
las
had to
partes
work with
y en el
the
aspecto
accomplices,
subjetivo se consideró
and in a
que los
subjective fashion,
imputados
they
habían
considered
sido
that the
colaboradores
accused
con plena
had collaborated
concienciación de que sus
completely
aportes
conscious
serían
that their
una
contributions
gran
were
ayuda para la comisión del hecho.
helping the
En
criminal
ese
action.
sentido, la Fiscalía puso de resalto la
So the
necesidad de
prosecutor's
una
office
relación estratégica de los
actually
militares
talked
y los
about a
sectores del
strategic
empresariado,
partnership between the
y esto
corporation
fue
and the military personnel,
probado
and
con
this
pruebas
was actually
documentales,
proven by documentary
declaraciones de
evidence
testigos de la
and by
declaración de
declaration of
testigos,
evidence and
que con
experts that
verdadera intención
testified during the trial,
consistente
were
en
common interests
garantizar la
to
normalización de las
guarantee the
relaciones laborales
normalization of
y una
working
profunda
relationships
modificación del
and
proceso
the deep
económico y
modification
social.
of economic and social
De ese modo se
processes
demostró
were discussed. In this
a partir
fashion,
de
they demonstrated
1976
that
que
after
bajo la amenaza
1976, in March of
del golpe de Estado,
1976,
el gobierno de facto introdujo un
the
giro
de facto government
económico
actually shifted
que
the
implica un
economic
cambio en las
perspective,
reglas
and
de
this implied a
acumulación de
change
capital
in the
para
accumulation of
pasar de la
capital
etapa de industrialización
leaving behind the industrialization phase and turned it into a financial economy and not a manufacturing economy. And this was an enormous drop in the industry. During this time, foreign capital companies went back to their own countries, like what happened with General Motors that left the country in 1978. Despite this, and in that particular context, Ford grew quite a bit and became a very important company during the dictatorship. This was during the years 1979 and 1980, more or less, as the second company with the most sales and the biggest foreign capital company, foreign investment company that Ford was working in. That was that time Ford Motor Argentina was the most profitable branch office of Ford Motor Company in the whole world. And that's the advantage that they had during the conflict. Between 1975 and 1976, it was very important to note that they benefited from this, and this affected the production and the profitability of Ford. And union activities or syndicate activities by internal parties affected the economic interests of the corporation. And those were the changes that the de facto government actually used. And Ford took advantage of the situation with an increase of production and increase of earnings, and in parallel with a loss of benefits and less social well-being for the workers.
También pusimos énfasis respecto
We
al
also
desempeño de los
emphasized on the
trabajadores en la
performance of
fábrica.
those that were accused in the
En el caso de
factory.
Müller,
Like in the case of
recordemos que era
Mueller,
gerente de manufactura,
he was the manufacturing
ya como
manager,
autoridad de
and
fábrica,
we estimated that he was the authority in the factory.
dado el cargo, tenía bajo su responsabilidad la
And
producción
under
de
his
los
responsibility, he had to
zapatillazas
produce the
para
different
máquinas de
products that were
generación
commercialized by companies. And Mueller was also the
cuando el
president of that
presidente
company.
estaba
When the
ausente.
president was absent, he was
Por
the
su parte,
deputy president.
García, que era el jefe de seguridad de la fábrica,
And he was all
según
so the civil security monitor, and he controlled any personnel that came in or out, or any visits that were came to factory. And he also controlled the security company that Ford had actually hired as well, that was composed by the ex-members of the army and the navy. So this accredited that the different culprits allowed them to capture the workers that were against them, which were actually the victims of the case. In the final arguments for the Ford case, the prosecutor's office tried to demonstrate, and the court sentence determined that this was true, how and why the manufacturing managers and security managers that had control of everything that came in and out of the factory, and especially that controlled everything that happened within the establishment. This was possible by analyzing what it means to have the Ford uh, production method, which is a scientific method that is based on the absolute control of what occurs in the work location and the production line. So it was impossible to think that you have 24 people kidnapped, 24 workers, and they would be transferred to an internal location within the plant to be tortured without the knowledge of the managers of the corporations or would have dominion of the situation. And the same thing was said about the transfer of all the victims outside of the factory in trucks that the company provided to take these personnel or these workers to the different jail cells that they were held in temporarily in the public commissary's office.
a los dos gerentes respecto
So the two managers had complete knowledge of this, of everything that happened in the factory, because obviously they were always monitoring what was going on in the factories. And this allowed us to conclude that they definitely knew about the usage of company vehicles to commit these crimes where the victims were taken outside of the factories, bringing them in and out of the factory, that they had knowledge about where the hidden detention centers were, where the workers were taken after being illegally kidnapped and deprived of their liberty, and necessarily they knew what occurred in that sector, including the brutal torments and tortures that the people that were kidnapped suffered, and how the victims discussed this before the judges during the trials. And finally, they analyzed the classical proposal argument of the company that they argued that it was impossible to act according to law. Ford, via their communications, they had affirmed that it was impossible to act in any other way. And the document that was sent was Ford's response against was titled Ford's response against accusations that they were involved during abuses during a military dictatorship in 1975 to 1976. This is the name of the document and it's dated March 8th of 2007. In the document, the company seeks to talk about Ford's relationship with the acts. First of all, they refer to the problems related to security that from 1973 the company had due to threats and attacks that, according to what they explained, had even caused the death of a worker. Later on, in different communications, Ford actually withdraws themselves from the military actions and affirmed that the government and the military had actually um, started to work. And in March of 1976, with the coup due to a government decision outside of the control of the company, the army was actually installed directly within the company. The army came in and took control right there, and they began to work as a military area. And different communications add that the activities that happened by the military personnel during that time were absolutely independent of Ford and not linked to the policies and the procedures of Ford Corporation.
Disculpa interrumpirte,
Forgive
Marcelo.
me for interrupting you. You have 2 minutes left, Marcel. So let me summarize. So we actually value, or the prosecutor's office really values, without saying if the company knew what was happening or not, we try to explain that in truth, the responsible parties from the companies were not able to do anything because the military had taken over. And what occurred was their actions, and the company was in an open and collaborative attitude with these authorities, and they were going to provide any available information to clarify the actions. And that's what the different management of Ford had actually committed to, and the Ford Corporation had committed to via their communications that they published through time. And this information
La
to
situación
clarify the
había sido
situation had
por
already been
Ford
offered by
en el
Ford
año
in
1983 al seno de
1983
la Comisión Nacional de
before the International Commission of People's Disappearance that was created immediately after they restored the democratic order. According to our criteria, these explanations, we saw that they did not actually support the evidence that the trial had come up with, or not only had they demonstrated the complete knowledge that the company actually had from the repression of these workers that was developed in the plant itself, but actually that the people in charge of the company at the time had actually allowed and facilitated the necessary resources so that the army would actually have a hidden place within the place to interrogate and torture the workers. And apart from that, they had actually pointed people out and provided substantial data for the correct individualization of pointing out of the victims that had to be punished. And they provided information regarding to these people and their spaces, their vehicles, and they provided actually food for the troops as well as housing. And at the same
estaban
time
llevándose
that the kidnappings were occurring in the company itself, there were actually some people that were just that were fired because they said that the people were absent, and the board of directors and the management knew very well that they were not absent from work, but they were actually kidnapped
en el interior de la planta,
within the plant itself, and they were fired for not showing up to work. And apart from that, they were illegally held against their will under inhumane conditions. And the company would continue to have a collaborative attitude in this regard. So we actually fought against this. And years after what occurred, the company actually denied to provide information to Aconadet. And this by the order given by the corporate president by with the intervention of the chief of human resources. His name was Galarraga, as- and precisely they were charged until they died. During the trial, they actually talked about the report that Ford Motor Argentina was not going to provide any information related to what had happened with their personnel, nor would they allow the books to be shown either, nor the files to be handed over. And as you can clearly see, the attitude of collaboration with justice was not there, and that's allowed us to conclude that if the management of the company continued to participate to try to stop the investigation, and that management of the company decided they were not going to provide investigations precisely because they had that information, and if they hoped to not allow the documentation to come to light, it's precisely because they had a lot of things to hide. So definitely, the results of the trial ended up proving both things. I think I used my time, and I thank you for your attention.
Muchísimas gracias, Marcelo. Y
Thank you
bueno,
very much, Marcelo. Thank you very much to both of you.
temas aquí pendientes. Yo tengo
There's a lot of issues.
curiosidad, ¿no? Son
I'm
decisiones
a bit curious. These are not totally different decisions. We see in Brazil an agreement with the company. In the case of Argentina, we see this court sentence against individuals, not against the corporation itself. But before we go into the technical details, what these two decisions have in common was
carácter post justicia, post
the
transición, ¿no?
post-transitional justice or post-conflict
Justicia
scenario during a transitional justice system, or when we were building historical memory, like in Argentina. So the question would be, and I know both of you touched upon this issue a little bit, but I think that we can go more into more details. The issue of the truth commissions or transitional justice mechanisms. Marcelo was speaking about CONADEP, and Marlon was also telling us a little bit about the lack of details that existed in these reports, in these final reports of the commissions of truth commissions.
Es para los dos, ¿no? ¿Cuál fue el
This
rol
question is for both of you. What was the role
mecanismos de estos
of these
reportes
mechanisms, the role of these reports, of these bodies of investigation and search for truth and construction of memory in order to promote these causes in the Ford cause as well as in the agreement that was signed with Volkswagen? So I'll give each of you 3 minutes to answer that question. So 4 minutes to see if you have any comments or answer for this question. Marlon, do you want to begin? Yes, of course. Thank you, Tatiana. Yes, as I said in my presentation, the issue of human rights violations by corporations and their accomplice roles was actually examined by the Truth Commission, but the result was unsatisfactory due to the times, due to the priorities, and due to the great amount of issues that the Truth Commission was working on at that time. And it's very interesting that when the different unions come to the prosecutor's office and they ask us to continue the investigation. In fact, even an ex-commissioner signed this request, the commissioner that had coordinated this investigation line. So there's a recognition. And here it's also very interesting to say that when we signed the agreement with Volkswagen,
Eu mencionei
and I
que
mentioned that a group
da sociedade civil não estava de
from civil
acordo,
society did not agree 100% with our agreement.
a que estava
Well, the
vinculada
group
esta
that
comissionada
this commissioner was linked to was that specific group.
com el acordo.
Even today, they're not in agreement with this agreement, and that's part of the process. Obviously, it's a plural process, multifaceted, and it wasn't unanimous. So it's also important to say that in Brazil, truth commissions, we've had the characteristic of several state commissions of truth,
Comissões
such
municipais.
as municipal
outro capítulo que poderia
This is
aqui
another chapter that
tempo para explicar
we can dedicate some time to
o
explain
que significa isso, pero
why and what this means,
encontro de
but it's
hoje.
not the purpose of today's encounter.
La Comisión de la Verdad del
So the
Estado
Truth Commission from the state of Sao Paulo,
mucha
they,
atención para
in fact, they did dedicate quite a bit of attention to this, obviously, because Sao Paulo is the industrial center of Brazil, especially during the dictatorship. They had this aspect very strongly linked.
conteúdo mais
So
interessante
it
lá no
has
Estadual
more
de la Verdad.
interesting
Inclusive,
aspects. In fact, they had investigated Volkswagen closely, but they did not come to the same conclusions that we came to. In truth, we went much more into depth
especificar,
or
explicar,
to specify and to explain and to actually look at the role and the dimensions that the company, and also perceiving that many other companies are also involved in different fashions with human rights violations during the dictatorship and their nature as accomplices with the perpetrators.
eu creio que isso é muito importante,
So I
como
think
disse,
that it's very important to say that
único
there isn't a unique actor that is going to completely reveal the truth. These are processes. And if the inputs that came from the commission, those that came from civil society that worked with the commission, they helped us quite a bit. That was
foi nosso
their
ponto de
starting point. The final point was our starting point. Their final point was our starting point. So it's very important to perceive that there's certain synergy that was actually built. And
sequencial.
if it's not, at least if it's not simultaneous, it's consecutive, that we take advantage of the work that was done beforehand. We also took advantage of quite a bit of the information from the reparation commissions. In Brazil, there's two federal commissions, and we took advantage of the processes that they had against Volkswagen as well. So this is a grouping together of a lot of information that actually allowed us to interact. And actually, there's a there's a similarity with our process of investigation with those that had been investigated by the Truth and Memory Commissions.
Gracias, Marlon. Marcelo.
Thank you, Marcelo.
Bueno, la
Very
trayectoria
well.
de punición en la Argentina no
Well, history in Argentina has not followed a lineal landscape. History has actually oscillated quite a bit. The arrival of democracy in 1983, for example, brings with it the beginnings of a new transitional justice mechanism in the country. The CONADEP was created, the first Truth Commission, which actually ended its work with a lot of success, and the maximal responsible parties from those that were condemned, even in the board in 1995. This actually talked about the violation of the amnesty laws that was instated by the military dictatorship and the crumbling of the interpretation that military personnel had actually done with their own rights. So the first tracking of responsibility of crimes against humanity identified in the beginnings of processes related to memory, truth, and justice, because during the working of the National Commission against uh, the Commission of Crimes Against People, CONAVET, and in the trials, they registered witness testimony of workers that had labor conflicts, and that already highlight the responsibility of management members in the committing of crimes such as the kidnappings. What's more, the CONADEP report identifies the actual workers as the larger category, but they mention maybe a percentage that is bigger than 30% of all the victims. The working class was the one that was affected the most. The workers were affected the most. And the Argentinian report simply mentions the workers as victims of the Santa repression with a company corporate military alliance that would actually be of the interest of the liberal governments. Even in the CONADEP, we have the witness testimony of Adolfo Omar Sanchez that talks about an emblematic event that occurred in the Ford factory with General Pacheco, which was mentioned several times in the trial, in the oral hearings. Sanchez had affirmed that he had been tortured in the Ford plant after a union meeting with the manager of corporate relationship. His last name was Galarraga, that actually died during the process. The manager told the representatives of the unions that
el golpe de Estado,
after the coup,
la compañía ya no reconocería
the corporation would no longer recognize the delegate workers
haciéndose una broma.
and saying that this is a joke. When you go out, they say, say greetings to my friend Camps when you see him. That's what they would tell the worker
Al delegado.
or to the delegate.
Camps se estaba
Camps
refiriendo al conocido
was referring to
torturador
a known torture
en el ámbito de la provincia de Buenos Aires.
in the province of Buenos
El
Aires.
testimonio de Sánchez relata que
And Sanchez's testimony highlighted that after he was kidnapped, they began to look for other syndicate leaders, and then the different delegates and other workers actually worked with this. This testimony also revealed the truth about the kidnapping and the torture and illegal detention of the 24 Ford companies.
También, bueno, mencionaba las
And
declaraciones
also, we were mentioning the declarations of the victims before Conaveb.
primero en una visita
And first of all, they had an official visit to the factory where the company
ya lo mencioné
actually
anteriormente,
obstructed
se compulsaran los archivos.
us to look
Se
at the
aplicó
different
derivó también en la
files.
designación
And it
del
also had to
entonces
do with
Secretaría de Derechos
the
Humanos
announcement that the Human Rights Secretariat worked with before the military
General
justice.
Rivero, que era el
And
máximo
General Rivera,
responsable
which was the maximum responsible party from the military section
de los hechos y otros dos
related to those facts, and other two military personnel actually provided witness testimony, but the laws related to impunity or due diligence did not actually help the businesses, but in fact they gave impunity, and they definitely they frustrated the process at that time, despite it being overcome later on.
Después tuvimos acá los juicios de la verdad,
Okay,
las
the
leyes de
the
impunidad.
justice, the sentences for truth against laws against impunity,
En esto tuvo que ver mucho las organizaciones de derechos
and we had many human rights organizations help us out in this regard, and civil society organizations. I understand that they played a fundamental role in the evolution of transitional justice.
En su incansable lucha por el
In their
reconocimiento
tireless recognition for the
consiguieron que la
judgment of the crimes, they've made sure
impunidad
that
como forma de ser política
it's not consolidated against these political ways of working with atrocities, and thanks to the commitments
de las
with
víctimas,
justices and the truth
familiares y
by
organizaciones
victims and families and human rights organizations like Abuela, the
agrupacionistas.
Plaza de Mayo
Que
mothers,
la memoria
the
política se convierte en
that
un aspecto
political
central
memory becomes a key aspect in Argentina.
y en un escenario de impunidad
And in a scenario due to impunity that made judicial proceedings an obstacle, they had to innovate in order to claim justices
la lucha por
through
la
these
verdad
truth sentences.
de
The
ser
fight
parte
to find out the truth,
como medio de acción.
they
La
actually
justicia
accepted
sin la
the
prueba
right to truth as a justice means without having criminal investigations. So justices, truth justices, actually collected many of the witness testimony by Ford workers,
con la anulación de estas leyes
and with the removal of these laws,
eh,
that in one way or another,
dejaron el camino libre para poder seguir con los
they
juicios
freed up the path to continue with the trials
las condenas
that
respectivas.
received their respective sentences.
Gracias. Muchas gracias, Marcelo.
Thank you very much,
Am,
Marcelo.
con un poquito de miedo a hacer una pregunta muy técnica.
This is a very
Pero-
technical question. I'm a
que
bit
creo
afraid
que
to ask
es
it, but I think
necesario
it's
entender
very
la
necessary
diferencia
to
porque
understand the
la
differences
estrategia
of why they chose a strategy
contrario y no la
versus
otra, digamos.
the opposite, why you
En el
chose
caso
one
de
strategy over another.
Volkswagen,
In the case of Volkswagen in Brazil,
se fue directamente por la subsidiaria.
you directly went after
Am,
the subsidiary of Volkswagen,
la pregunta
Marlon.
aquí
So the question would be,
ese
why
fue solamente el caso en contra de
simply
la entidad
against
local, digamos,
the
en contra de
local entity and not against
de la
individuals
empresa.
or
Y
business
para
executives? And the
Marcelo,
same thing goes for Marcelo
que
in this particular case,
el caso
because
se abre en
the
contra
case
estas dos
is opened
personas,
up against these two
no,
people
no digamos en contra de la
and not
compañía o de
against
la entidad
the
local.
corporation itself or the legal entity. And I think that we're trying to understand
Términos de estrategias, ¿no? Y como
in
antes hemos
strategic
hablado, por ejemplo, con
terms
Marlon sobre estos temas de
before
prescripción
we
de
talked with Marla about statutes of
que
limitations
será
and deadlines and different instances that are selected. And I think it's important for the public to understand why
la elección que se hizo en
this was chose this during that time.
Sí, Tatiana. En verdad, el tema
Yes, Tatiana, the truth is that
de falência, não?
This is an issue related to
Como o
failures.
sistema penal não está aberto
Criminal system, since it's not actually duly open
para estar certo de contas de
to provide
responsabilização de perpetradores individuais,
or to work with perpetrators.
a opção foi
Well, the option was
por el camino
to continue
de reparação
using a civil reparation methodology instead against the corporation, obviously, because that's where they have the capital and that's where they have the responsibility. So it's a very pragmatic approach, really.
para que ter algum tipo de justiça que
So if we
seja
would have any type of justice, it would be a justice, at least a corporate justice. The truth is that the ideal would be both sides, individual reparation,
que aí sim
criminal reparation, which is
preferencialmente porque em Brasil
preferentially, because in Brazil, we don't have criminal responsibility of a legal corporation or companies are not legally viable except for environmental crimes.
esse seria o cenário perfeito e
So
para
that
lá
would be the perfect scenario. And also to work on reparations and access accounts.
vale todavía se puede pero
But the
claro
path is not closed completely. We can still continue, but obviously within the priorities of the criminal section,
concluir os processos
we're trying to conclude what processes involve direct perpetrators more directly. It's interesting, but understanding that Volkswagen was a bit similar to what Marcelo mentioned. So the internal security system for the company actually allowed the state security apparatus to come in and turn on everything during the factory. They would allow them to be tortured, and they would be disappeared. They were not definite. They were like temporary kidnappings or disappearance, all with the participation of the corporation. And the corporation actually offered quite a lot of information about the political activities of their functionaries and workers that culminated in the arrest of many of them. So in this scenario, but the options, the legal options would be
sí pero
in
nosotros
parallel, but we would still not begin with criminal aspects.
cenário que
Well, there's not the scenario which is very contrary, but we can't discard this for the future. Thank you, Marlon. And before we go on to Marcelo for 2 minutes, with this, I'm going to open up the floor for Q&A. We already have a few questions from the public, while Marcelo will answer this question.
Sí, bueno,
Yes,
ante-
well,
ante el contexto de impunidad
in
que
terms of the impunity
que en
context,
algún momento
that in certain
aplicaron
moments,
las leyes
the
de
laws
vida y punto final,
of public hearings
eh,
had,
de alguna forma esto sucedió en la década de los 90.
this happened in the 1990s in Argentina, in one way or another in that decade. The perseverance of the victims and the groups of workers, their perseverance actually allowed them to find justice in other countries. And in that fashion,
Los trabajadores
the workers
también solicitaron sanciones
also
penales
requested
contra la compañía
civil actions against the companies in the US. Throughout all of these years, the company always denied their participation during all these years. In the criminal environment, we don't have the possibilities either to actually have corporations respond criminally speaking in criminal courts in terms of issues related to working environments where we know that the workers actually suffered.
En el ámbito criminal,
At least in a criminal environment, the possibilities or the workers, their possibilities are reduced to pursue criminal actions against the perpetrators or the management of the company, but the companies cannot respond according to our law in a criminal fashion. So that's what we can do.
Muchas gracias, Marcelo.
Thank you very
Voy
much, Marcelo.
a una de las preguntas que
Now
tenemos.
let's go directly to one of the questions that we have from one of the participants. This question is for Marlon. And Marlon, first of all, they're congratulating you for this very innovative case. You've explained how the payment was divided between amongst the survivors and former employers, and also different human rights causes, organizations, and academic institutions.
Las
So the
preguntas.
questions are, Can you please explain how these allocations were determined? Were there particular principles employed in designing the reparations? Was there resistance to giving some of the money to groups who were not direct victims?
Gracias por la pregunta. Sí.
Thank you for the questions. This is a very difficult issue about how to define this allocation. The truth is what we did were two different research fronts and defining values, basically, which were a bit separate. One, to define the total amount of indemnification for the workers and the direct victims or their family members. We tried to maintain this issue of the amounts of the different reparation as something precisely to not have so many conflicts, so much conflict. And in fact, it would be a strategy that worked quite well. And in a certain fashion, a strategy related to a negotiation table. And we allowed one issue to be dealt with by one of our actors, which was the public ministry and the labor ministry, which was
Dessa
part of
força-tarefa,
this task force. So we decided that they would do the investigation according to the parameters for working presidents and issues related to individual callings of victims. And we would do the negotiation, the other different investigations. Obviously, the company came, it came a moment where the company said I want to have a total number. I want to have a global number. And there we all just sat down and came to an agreement. So on these issues of defining how much would be for the workers and the other lines, it wasn't something of a big, it wasn't a conflict. It wasn't the most difficult thing to come about or to come to a conclusion. The most difficult thing was to define within the collective reparation lines to indirect victims or reparations of a collective nature or diffuse nature, how to actually do these allocations or these values. And here we also had problems in the middle of the path. It may sound incredible, but when we were very advanced in Brazil, there was a very big problem with the negotiation of the reparation of this operation of auto lavado. I'm not sure how you call them, lavajato or car washing, which was actually discussing a reparation of Petrobras
e modelo
corruption
que ha sido uma
and a model
crise
that was that's a crisis due to a lack of transparency was opposite of what we were doing, but it would allow the company to reject a model that we were almost ready to sign.
a toda uma discussão sobre
So this came back to a discussion how to do this reparation, which was not the ideal from our point of view, but it was more of a possible reparation. And it took us 6 months to solve this issue, this problem, this intermittent problem.
os critérios são critérios de
But the criteria were
suficiência de montos,
of
ou seja, não eram
related to
valores
the sufficiency of the amounts. These were not arbitrary numbers. If we wanted an amount to actually build a memory center, then we had a budget of what would be needed to build this. It wasn't something that we just came up with out of nothing. If we wanted to contribute to a DNA lab, a modern state-of-the-art DNA lab, then we needed a budget. If we wanted to have new investigations, what is the capacity to have investigations? So how many investigators can we manage or we handle? So there was an actual, there was a lot of criteria about the details and to see how much these amounts would come up to.
Muchísimas gracias, Marlon. Y aquí es donde empezamos
Thank you very much, Marlon. This is where
todos los eventos,
we
¿no? Que nos
begin.
llenamos de
What happens in every event where we are filled with a lot of questions at the end and then we have no time. So let's try to respond as quickly, as best as possible.
Otra pregunta que
But
tenemos
another
acá
question that we have here
papel de los actores
is in terms of the role of
Alemania y Estados
different state actors, such as in Germany or the US, that facilitate abuses that benefited these subsidiaries, like Volkswagen and Ford in this particular case. So the question would be, do you have any responsibility
a estos abusos? Y si esta
of
responsabilidad
answering to these responses? And if these responsibilities do exist, or your responsibility with the experience that you have in these particular cases from your own experience and looking at the role of the headquarters in Germany and in the US, this question is for both of you. And I think that in 1 or 2 minutes, try to be as concise as possible. Marcelo, do you want to begin?
Bien. A ver, en un territorio bajo
Well,
control estricto,
in a territory which is under the strict control, I ask myself if somebody, some serious person would determine that can actually decide that a hidden location can exist without the knowledge of the companies and the security chiefs, which were also retired military personnel, and they would end their working days, ending working in the U.S. Embassy in Argentina. Could the manager of manufacturing actually not know about the situation that actually occurred in the plant? Would that be possible for them not to know? And in the same fashion, could this happen in Buenos Aires without the go ahead from the headquarters from Ford in Detroit? I think not. For me, that's impossible. That would be negative because apart from being forced to collaborate in the company, they actually benefited. So that argument, they actually, with blood, they were actually destructure unions and mobilizations that in June and July they had during the agreement of 1975, an agreement that was signed. The sales of the company in millions of
por 6
dollars were multiplied by sixfold in 1976 when we compare it to the previous year. But apart from this, the profit and loss balance sheet gave Ford first place in terms of the rest of the corporations that car manufacturers. And this position was observed clearly in the fact that the company occupied the first place by volumes of production, displacing Fiat, and in a crisis context where several different terminals, as I mentioned earlier, General Motors, for example, abandoned their Argentinian factories. So I think obviously they had the blessings from the Detroit headquarters because in a context where the car manufacturers were actually leaving the country and going back to country of origins, instead Ford actually increased their production and earnings
la respuesta
sixfold.
está a la vista.
So I think the answer is obvious. Tatiana, well, first of all, this is something that makes me curious. It's very similar as Ford and Volkswagen's cases were actually very similar. They Volkswagen became the most profitable company in multinational in Brazil at that time as well during the dictatorship. So it's very impressive that this is the case. And obviously, this was a very important part of the investigation that Christopher Copper made. That in his report refers that the headquarters infers that they had the details, not the details, but that they had. They're saying that everything is well. Continue to do what you're doing. That's what the headquarters says. And democracy is not our problem. That's Brazil's problem. So, in fact, there's actually co-responsibility for the directors of Germany and Brazil to say that, hey, look, there's something that's happening here that we're ashamed to actually be part, like if it was like the Nazi party would do this, but actually our performance is doing well if we continue to do this. Just if so the headquarters actually knew what was happening. So the question is if it refers to state agents in Germany. Well, in this particular case, we have no evidence to determine that state agencies had the information. But as Marcelo said, we supposing that the German embassy did not follow up on what was happening with Volkswagen in Brazil that became a fundamental company within their relationships and other relations with Germany and Brazil. We have to think about that we would be too innocent to believe that they did not have knowledge. But from the legal point of view, obviously there was no evidence from the investigation that concluded this. So we don't have direct evidence to legally affirm this, but it seems that it would be very possible in this sense for them that they had knowledge. State actors. I think we have time for just one more question that we have in the chat, and then I'll give Gabriel the word. Perhaps we'll have one additional question that we can answer for Marcelo, but I'll send you the question, Marcelo, a bit later on.
Pendiente. Pero esta pregunta, yo creo que
But this
tal vez
question, I think this question is more relevant for the Volkswagen cases, But this question is for both of the cases that these companies, their motivation to collaborate in an investigation and the issues of reparations, like what motivated them to work together in these investigations and in the reparations. Well, I think the person that has to answer these are the representatives of the corporations themselves. We really have no knowledge. I wouldn't know. The only thing I wanted to say is that we began our investigation when Volkswagen was actually precisely just leaving the diesel scandal related to the diesel contamination. I'm not sure if this had any factors or played a role. The truth is, I don't have an answer to this question. This question we would have to ask this of the representatives of the company. It's very important to also to consider the context, the political context and the social context that perhaps can help us with a legal strategy to make it more effective as well. Thank you, Marlon. Marcelo, I'm not sure if you have any other comments. No, I have the same comment to ask to add that Marlon asked. Unfortunately speaking, I don't have the answer either. Obviously, the corporations would have the answer themselves in
No,
terms
yo no
of
lo
the question. I think the company, unfortunately, I can't know.
Te voy a,
Gabriel,
a dar el espacio. Sé que creo
I'm
que
going to give
tenías
you
una
a space. I think you had a question as well.
entonces algunos comentarios
And
de,
so you can give us a few closing remarks before we close the event. Well, thank you very much, Marcelo and Marlon. The truth is, as always, we're very happy to speak with you, but even more, we're so happy to work with so much commitment for human rights. And you guys know how much I admire you. And several times we thank you. Thank you for taking time for the space. I'm not gonna ask you some much time to the space because we don't really have that much time. But just some final comments, like Tatiana was mentioning. Well, I think in general, all of us that are here that work on these issues related to civil society, related to the prosecutor's office, some judges, the academic sector, certain academics, we would like for memory, truth, and justice processes related to economic issues would just flow and well and in a fair world, in a just world, that would have to happen. But transitional justice is not like that. And I think that like the Ford case and the Volkswagen cases, they're representative cases for several reasons. Or basically, they showcase that these are positive cases, but at the same time, they're exceptions to the rule. The rule is almost always impunity, and in Latin America, even more, where we have a lot less coverage, a lot less accusations in this regard. We know that the impunity gap is very deep in Latin America. So there we know that justice, memory, and truth, at least truth and justice, that's where we have more state involvement, will always be much more miserable than what we would like to see. But in terms of these cases, they force us to think that after so many decades and after so many atrocities, we have to be much more strategic. We're not going to have a cascade of cases as we see like in human rights cases where we have to think about better innovative strategies and actually be very decisive to understand where and how we promote certain cases. I think that uh, Marcelo and Marlon's experiences can actually be related to what strategies we should think about and how we have to think strategically in order to identify and select cases, which is something complicated. But when we're on the side of the victims, because how do we select the cases? But at least we have to have to understand how we select strategies. And I think another very interesting thing, and we see that these two cases have synergy, like breaking these segments, these parallel segments that generally we have in the prosecutor's office. And on one side we have justice, on the other side we have the people that file the lawsuits. On the other side we have civil society, national and international. And I think in both cases, this intention that we have a synergy to advance in these cases and identifying the perpetrators helped us with these synergies. I think synergy of different national and international stakeholders is fundamental. And within these cases, and I know these cases quite well because I've had the opportunity to follow them, and I've been benefited by Marcelo's and Marlon's investigations quite a bit. Well, that positioning of working together with the different local actors surrounding these cases as civil society and as associations, as the academic sector, I think that the two cases would be good to look at as examples of synergy strategies, national within countries and international among the different environments. And I also think it's fundamental, as Marcelo and Marlon proposed, that we have to work outside of the box. Like in the case that Marlon spoke about, the legal arguments of saying how we turn this amnesty process that is a problem into something to our advantage. And in the case of Marcelo's cases of working with different layers of command, and we've been working on this in crimes against humanity in Argentina. So we have to think differently in judicial strategies. So where we start to work with these cases, we have to continue to realize that we can't continue to just work with inertia that activists, practitioners, or militants have been promoting and crimes against humanities. Obviously, there's a peculiarity to each country, and Marcelo Marlon talk about those individual legal hurdles in each country. And then in terms of evidence collection, 40 years after, it's been very difficult, and different actors that have been outside of the scope of the law for so much time. So to prepare ourselves for this, we have to think that we have to link this to collection of evidence, like the truth commissions, as Marlon talked about in Brazil. The platform was very important to contribute to evidence, but it was still insufficient to have a criminal case. And in the case, Marcelo went through the processes, and every moment and every decade of these never-ending transitional justice process, and how each of these proposed and gave us evidence, but all of it has been insufficient. Perhaps for state actors like in Argentina, it would be sufficient, but we also have to think about how to differently collect evidence, and we have to have a cross-cutting approach in terms of working with historians and different people that work in corporations, the accountants, etc. And I think that when we think about these cases in a strategic fashion, we have to realize about incrementalism. Each of the two, both of them started to speak about something happened quite a long time ago. And as time advanced, there was a fact that they used to build the strategies and arguments. Unfortunately, thinking that in these processes, strategic processes, each of them can play a role and contribute to an incremental path that will help us in passing the ball and to send it to the other side of the field if we talk about soccer. So those of us that work on these issues, we have to realize that truth, memory, and justice and transitional justice processes are incremental approaches, and we can't forget that what we did in the past and that we're in the present, and some of people will follow us in the future. And what is also important, and which is, and my colleagues that are here and the different panelists that are here know very well that these are recurring issues. Like who's missing in these arguments. Obviously, the suspects that have always been important in other cases related to crimes against humanities that are not here either. Precisely, international players, international actors are not there. We still are missing bringing these international subjects to pressure to that via human rights organizations. Little by little, we're pushing different states to actually break that power that companies have about people working from abroad. Obviously, Inter-American Justice Court has started to work on this as well in their transitional justice approaches, and the human rights, the UN group for corporations and human rights from the UN is also working on these issues. In the Inter-American Commission, there's actually two cases from Argentina. One which was actually a confidential, friendly settlement. Marcelo knows this quite well. This is a case about a Ford employee, and we have the Sidelca case and the Techil case about civil reparations and settlements against with the company. So we have some things that are latent, but unfortunately speaking, we still are missing the international players. And before, since there's a lack of international pressure sometimes, there's other alternatives like the ones that were mentioned by Marlon and Marcelo earlier, strategies about working and pressuring in other countries. So I think in both cases, I really liked the strategies related to litigation. And I think Marlon and Marcelo are two very innovators, institutional innovators that are on the state side of things that are helping us out. So I simply wanted to thank both of you, Marcelo and Marlon, for the work you do and for participating today. And I wanted to thank the colleagues that made this event possible and all the participants that are here as well. Thank you very much. A big hug to all of you.
Muchísimas gracias a los dos. Siguiendo la
Thank you
línea
to
de
both of
casos,
you.
sí, casos
Yes, I
novedosos,
think
estrategias
innovative cases and
diferentes,
strategies that are completely
pero
different.
que
Both cases are innovative
algo
and
que
very
quiero
interesting.
resaltar
And I
acá es
think
cómo
something
estamos
that wants
viendo
we want to highlight here is how we're actually
en
seeing
Europa el tema de derechos laborales,
the
la
issues
participación
of
de los
labor
sindicatos y la
rights
sociedad
and the
civil
role
en
of
este
unions and
tema.
civil
Creo
societies
que es
more close up. And I think this is fundamental.
muy importante que espero podamos seguir
And I
analizando.
hope that we can
Bueno,
continue to
terminando aquí,
analyze this important issue. So
nos pasamos, pero eso no está mal.
we
Esperemos
finished
que
quite a
este
bit
sea el
on
inicio
time, just
de
2 minutes
varias
over. I hope
conversaciones
that this is just the beginning of
interesantes
several presentations, several case
para
studies,
tener esta información y creo que
in order
veo un
to have this
mensaje sobre el
information. And I think that I see a message about the recording,
se pueden
where it's
inscribir
going to be
en nuestro
available.
boletín
You
de
can
información
also
de
register to our
Corporate
newsletter
Lab,
from Corporate Accountability Lab, that newsletter, and we'll send you information and we'll announce
de evento, ¿no? Entonces,
where these events will happen and where the recordings will be placed. So thank you, Marcelo and Marlon, for this very timely event, and thank you to our technical team as well that make this possible, and to Serapis and Adriana, whom were our interpreters today. Thank you very much. I hope that you have a great week. Thank you, Tatiana and Gabriel and Marcelo.
Un gran saludo para todos.
A special greeting to all of you.
Oyendo